Good afternoon. First, a shout out. Thank you to Suman, Nagatni, Tanvi, all the whole IFE team for including me. I'm mic'd. Should I speak louder?
Maple mic.
For including me in this conference, and as we've been talking about definitions of archives and emergent archives and homes and concepts, and it turns out IFA has been thinking about these ideas and funding for a very long time, because what the work I'm about to speak to you about was funded by an arts documentation research grant that was seed funded by it. And in a way, so this is a shout out to just say how prescient and thoughtful and imaginative you have been in thinking through, or beginning to conceptualize it with all of us, and for creating sort of a meta archive and a community for all of us to kind of speak to and maybe quibble with. Now the disclaimer, what I'm doing on this panel. So this is going to be very different. I'm not an archivist. This doesn't come from any kind of institutional practice. What I think I can offer you, I don't think I'm going to add anything to the notion of access from the point of view of archival practice. But what I can offer is sort of like a worm's eye view on a meditation on access from my perspective as a researcher and a user of botanical archives, which is, brings us back to a very different kind of materiality and intangibility coded into it, and I'll talk about it a little bit more, including the corny neologism of the archive, or the spelling of archive, and why it fits this particular subject so well. But it's also from, as a curator of archive-based exhibitions, and I just thought here's an installation shot of a recent collections-based exhibition we did at the Wellcome Library, in which collecting history and provenance was the narrative thread. And that was kind of unusual, because we were able to actually quote both the letters, the correspondence between the collection, the collecting agent, and the pharmaceutical giant founder of Wellcome, with all kinds of quotes that implicated how he wanted to exploit India's sort of pharmaceutical heritage. But it's also because I'm someone who likes to think about archives, and we've all been thinking about them, and to paraphrase a padre who I think riffs off Levi-Strauss archives, it turns out are extremely good to think with, as physical sites, of course, but also, as Romina Kapur said yesterday about museums, Suzy Tharu said today, as epistemological sites of conflict, contest, friction, with multiple meanings of what archives should hold, how they were acquired, how they are arranged, and how they are made available. All of which, of course, challenge issues of access, but also provenance and returns. And I hope we can talk about that a little bit. And it in turn creates new anxieties about ownership, authorship, and authenticity. I will focus on colonial archives, one of the 21st century's most critical contact zones, from my disciplinary location and from the viewpoint of the particular archive I do study. The discipline is critical heritage studies. I'm interested in those moments that we've been talking about over these 2 days, those contact zones where the archival impulse of 21st century information society context meet ever widening definitions of what culture is and what heritage is. The UNESCO calls it from genes to folklore. And as definitions of culture are expanding from tangible to intangible, built to ephemeral, I'm particularly interested in the paradoxes, the underbelly, the dilemmas of making such archive knowledge public, legible, through digitization. And to get back to a theme of forgetting is the opposite of, not exactly the opposite, but Derrida's notion of archival forgetting sort of speaks to the silences, the invisibilities, the hidden gaps, the fault lines that get encoded into the archive's very assembly. So with colonial archives, this means also the difficult subject of decolonizing knowledge, that another buzzword and much debated. But in terms of restitution, how do we redistribute? I should add very quickly here that I take inspiration from two literatures on archival access in the context of decolonization. One is a wonderful project called Refiguring the Archive that came from South Africa at the University of Witwatersrand, from which I borrow the important notion that colonial archives meant to preserve and conserve memory can also bury colonial past. I know Shubha is a big fan of that project too. Another inspiration comes from what is loosely called the heritage trouble literature, and that's where my title comes from, where scholars and activists are beginning to lay out the paradoxes of making knowledge accessible to the public through digitization and cultural documentation. So I'll just give you two quick examples. Michael Brown, in his eponymous article called Heritage Trouble, looks at the unintended consequences of heritage protection schemes after the 2003 UNESCO Convention was ratified, with its mantra of documentation before protection. And what happens as they increasingly turn this archived knowledge into cultural property, into a proprietary resource to be owned, claimed, possessed. There are others. Claire Harris talks about how digitization in her case of Tibetan archival photos dislodges the object from the record, making it vulnerable to different regimes of truth-telling. My own work on making heritage legible, making medical heritage legible builds on this, showing some of the complexities of heritage protection on the ground and how archiving medical botanical knowledge in particular can work as a double-edged sword, because it opens it up to new potential for commercial exploitation through unfair patent regimes. We've been talking about copyright, but here's another way in which knowledge has been misappropriated, which have serious material consequences for the authors or source communities they are derived from. My field site, the colonial archive I'm beginning to study and trace and chase across continents, is the botanical archive. What I had called in an early grant to the IFA, the archive with a K, I admit a bit sheepishly that it may sound a bit glib at first, but at least to my ears it did. But it captures so well that sense of preserving natural history and Edenic pasts from imminent destruction that people liked it and it stayed. Archive with a K also captures the fact that botanical collections are inherently diverse, multi-genre, multi-format, mixing living and historical collections, dried plants. On the left you have a dried specimen that usually goes into botanical herbaria, and botanical illustrations on the right of the same plant. So, it shows you why the art became important at a particular point when botany was developing as a science, art and science. And here for this very short presentation, I will focus just on the botanical art collections from a period that art historians call company school or company kalam. A category that, for reasons I will outline, is not only deeply problematic as an archival label, but poses unique challenges to access. My own access and those, so we're talking about a dispersed archive across continents now. In art history terms, company school allows us to shine a light on a range of Indian artists working in what has historically been known as company style, a broad term for a variety of hybrid Indo-European styles of painting that developed in India by Indian artists, primarily under the patronage of the East India companies in the 18th and 19th century. This is the definition. And in the slide, I've tried to show you a different range of the kind of things that can come under this umbrella. On the top, you have copper plate engravings from the 18th century, from a Dutch botanical, and the ones on the lower left is lithograph, watercolor on the extreme right. So the genres themselves are different, and the way in which they schematize and draw their plants from nature is different too. Early descriptions of company style note that it blended miniature painting techniques with a more Western treatment of perspective, volume, and recession, and a change in medium from gouache to watercolor or sepia wash on European paper. This is one reason actually. Some of it has survived in the Calcutta archive, Calcutta Botanic Garden archive. But so if company botanical art is a subset of company kalam, if it can be defined at all, it reflects a unique visual tension between the naturalistic idiom that's emerging through the observational culture of scientific botany, that is drawing from nature, and the lingering intimacy, stylization, pattern, fact perspective found in miniatures and vernacular art forms. I should add that most company botanical art was made to be part of a flora, which is a published book, flora with a capital F, which is a published book describing the plants of a defined geographical area that uses an international system of nomenclature to relate the plant described to those in other regions of the world. This is a 19th century. It's sort of like one of the earliest flora to come out of India, and here are a few of the better known flora, along with the company botanists surgeons, East India Company surgeons was their title, but they were surgeon botanists. This is Roxburgh's plants of the coast of Coromandel and Flora Indica, which focused on the Calcutta and Samarkand regions. White's figures of Indian plants from the Madras Presidency area. Alexander Gibson's Dapuri drawings that documented Dapuri near Pune. When the paintings or drawings were unpublished, that is, when they did not make it into flora, I've included a little bit more to show you kind of schematized images that also were part of White's flora. But when these unpublished images did not make it into flora, they are known as icones, hortus icones, some numbering in the thousands, with copies today in both Calcutta Botanic Gardens and Kew Gardens in London. Typically, all of these flora and icones were compiled and held in the libraries of the major botanical garden that also held the related dried specimens and herbaria, because they had to be cross-referenced when looked at by the botanists. I should note that with tropical flora in the age of empire, the archival goal in the metropole, more than the colony, was the post-Linnaean botanical science of plant taxonomy. That is the naming and identification of new species that sitting there in Kew Gardens, some of them had never seen, which is why it's important to note that it was this new hybrid art form, company school, that drove the science, typologically, taxonomically, epistemologically, because the plants themselves did not survive passage, neither did the herbaria or the dried specimens kind of do that well as they travel there. Historically, when these botanical archives were first assembled in India, written description of exotic new tropical species were inadequate, and dried specimens, so for example the one on the left, while a vast improvement over words had limitations too, illustrations were the answer. An illustration could depict different stages of a plant not observable in a single specimen, and they're both, they're all of the same species. And some plant families also made very poor dried specimens, and illustrations could record information like the plant's color. This is the slide I started with. Yesterday, Romila Thapar reminded us that labels are very important, and I want to flag that here in the context of the archive. Company school as a category poses several problems for archival access, and I want to suggest that there are strong grounds for abandoning the label entirely, with its whiff of the pejorative, as Henry Norty calls it, not least that art historians in India have, until very recently, regarded these drawings as no part of their own tradition. This sort of self-imposed limitation was always problematic, because whatever the subject or the nationality of the commissioner, the vast body of work was the creation of Indian artists. Archivally speaking, surely it is perverse to name a body of work for its corporate commissioner rather than for any aspect of its creators, even if the artists were largely anonymous. But a second reason for abandoning the company school label with regard to botanical art is that it conceals the diversity one finds across the country in style, patronage, and the reticulate nature of artistic influences, especially in the South. Early art historians of company school like Mildred Archer had suggested that these were primarily Indian artists trained in Mughal miniature traditions who may have sought new European patrons after the collapse of the Mughal Empire. This may well have been true of places like Patna, Delhi, Lucknow and North India, but it is not true of South India, where, as we know through archival research, company surgeons responsible for compiling the major flora from India based in 18th and 19th century Madras and Samalkot and Tanjore and Dapuri and Mysore drew on artists from vernacular traditions such as chintz and kalamkari painters and godigars, woodworkers, as well as artist castes, the Telugu-speaking Muchis and the Kannada-speaking Jingers. These complex networks of artists and patrons are slowly, very slowly coming to light, but much remains to be done to open up the archive further through careful and systematic fieldwork in tracing the biographies, family histories of artists who dedicated so much to botanical illustration in the subcontinent. Finally, and this is the third and very real problem unique to company botanical art archives, has to do with the archival dispersal that these collections experienced as they traveled from colony to metropole. Plants are the world's original globalizers, and indeed the word diaspora derives from a botanical metaphor of the scattering of spores and seeds across the world. Company botanical art is the very epitome of dispersal, because today, especially in the case of the British East India Company, when increasing crown control over scientific production after 1857 meant that botanical archives, mostly from Calcutta Botanic Gardens at that time, got scattered between at least 3 archival homes in the metropole. One, the manuscript archives such as the British Library's India Office Library, which housed all the official correspondence of the company officials. 2, herbaria in the Royal Botanic Gardens of Kew and Edinburgh, which housed the dried plant specimens, the Hortus Sici, and the respective gardens libraries, which now house most of the plants and the drawings themselves. Which means the illustrations which sit in the Botanic Gardens libraries, physically different from the, distant from the herbaria and the manuscript documentation, are catalogued taxonomically by species, which is why when you go to the Calcutta Botanic Garden today, the art archive is accessed mostly by botanists who use them for taxonomic purposes. They make annotations on the paintings. It's a functional archive. They even make, but it's less accessible to art historians, let alone say the descendants of the artists who created them in the first place, or the public, whoever that may be. So given this scenario, what does it mean then to regain access or re-access to this huge, sprawling, extremely important and beautiful archive? The first step is to refigure it. And they in keeping with today's ethical standards of acquisition, preservation, provenance. So let me note a few ways in which this is happening, in which that I will call, in the spirit of alliteration that's running through this conference program, reunifying the archive, remembering, as in, literally inserting the artist's names into the archive, and reproducing the archive. I think I have time only to kind of talk about the reunification, but I'll take, I hope this will come up in discussion in terms of what reinserting the artist's names into this archive is doing in terms of potentially opening it up for notions of commercial copyright for the artist, the dangers of that. But with reunification, one of the best examples, there have been a few examples of this digital reunification of collections, but this one was particularly successful in its scope and reach. This was spearheaded by the Natural History Museum and Kew Gardens in London, working closely with the Calcutta Botanic Gardens. And it was titled Wallach and Indian Natural History. It brought together digitally archival information on company naturalist Nathaniel Wallach from the India Office Library papers, botanical drawings of his artists from both Kew and Calcutta Gardens, and dried specimens from the 2 herbaria to produce a mega archive which was searchable by image. So this made a huge difference in how one accessed everything. And then one could get to the makers, but through this botanical iconography, you begin to get a sense of the scope of this project. And by remembering, I'll just note this and then end. What I mean by this is, while the late 18th century botanical illustrations made in Calcutta, such as the Lady Impey album, they're well known and have been reproduced. It's the 19th century botanical art that has been entirely unstudied, the recent past, so to speak, even though it's such an important chapter in the history of botanical illustration. So of the artists whose names were recorded by company surgeons, Vishnu Prasad was first used by Francis Buchanan in the early 19th century, later by Robert White and John Royal, and I take great pleasure in actually inserting their names in my slides. White was unusually appreciative of his two Madras artists, Telugu-speaking Tanjore-based Rangaya and Govindu, and they're now beginning to do entire exhibitions from the point of view, I think, of other masters here, of sort of like what it means to kind of like find out the names of these artists and sort of like let them lead the way in which exhibitions are curated, and so on. This work is being done it's being led in the gardens and the libraries of Edinburgh by a dedicated group of archivists and historians who are working in the Edinburgh Gardens, led by Henry Nolte, who are doing admirable work in trying to painstakingly piece together many of these things by species, and which means sort of like saying when they are drawn from copy versus when they're drawn from nature, and it introduces the whole idea of what it means to have the notion of the copy in botanical illustration schools, which is creating its own new archive. But there are also other people here in India, Savitri Preeta Nair and Suresh Jairam are beginning to fill the gaps in other places like Tanjore and Bangalore. My own work has been inspired by these efforts, and I have been, with the help of the IFA grant, slowly documenting or trying to trace artist genealogies and attributions in the Nilgiris and the Dutch Malabar. Some of this is recorded in the website, in the IFA supported website called arsbotanica.net, and a small part of the research will be featured in a Marg magazine special issue on botanical art that we're working on. I want to end sort of by saying, what does it mean? I'll skip over the section on reproducing the archive and the problematic nature of the copy in this particular, in the botanical archive. But each of these methods to refigure the botanical archive raises a host of cultural anxieties about access. Digitally reunifying the archive, as in the Wallet project, continues to privilege the corporate commissioner, at least nominally, where the botanist's name provides the archival umbrella. That maybe that's the sort of like asymmetries of knowledge and power that we want to break away from. But how do we do that? Remembering, reinserting the artist's names involves a careful tracing of biography and botanical iconography where the records permit. But does this attribution then introduce possible problems of signature and maker's marks and authenticity that underlie commercial copyright regimes for the native artists as their prints enter the art market? At a time when, say, exhibitions and work like William Dalrymple's and Yutika Sharma's have shown that the same artists often painted for different patrons, thus making the Mughal company divide a false distinction. How do we responsibly trace artists' genealogies by region, caste, art form, or medium? How do we protect artistic innovation? And this is a question for all of those of you who are working in the genres of music and audiovisual archives. How do we do it without changing the content of the archive, without transforming the nature of knowledge itself, and without making either the art or the artist into a commodity? And in the case of artisanal caste groups, this raises a potential problem of unintentionally tribalizing or ghettoizing them, as art historian Annapurna Garimella writes about in terms of with the Gond art case. Are we now beginning to call this Aboriginalistan? And so sort of we have to be careful about these kinds of things. So in the end, if plants are the great diasporas and the globalizers, and the company school flora, that the documenters linking plant to place, will better access to botanical archives through digitization or open source knowledge, change those links to specific places, specific regions, specific gardens. And finally, the question that arises for the archive with a K will refiguring flora with the capital F through reunification, remembering, reproduction, transform the very thing it is meant to archive, document and preserve, namely the representation of the landscape, its biodiversity, and its extraordinary flora with a small f. So I'll end there. And you know, there's a lot more to talk about, but I think this comes up because it is a problem that we're all facing, and we don't know what to do with it, you know, as we use it. Thank you.